When you turn on American news channels these days, it is hard not to hear anyone mention treasury bonds. Tuberculosis is big. It is really big. But it is not new, is it? The United States has been mired in debt for some time. So why did everyone suddenly feel a little panicked? Journalists, investors, politicians, economists. Part of the answer is now on Capitol Hill, just passed by a narrow margin in the House of Representatives. This beautiful big bill combines border enforcement, immigration reform, and aggressive tax cuts into a comprehensive piece of legislation. It could pile up about $2.8 tn in federal debt over the next decade, according to the Congressional Budget Office. Every modern president has plunged America deeper into deficits, so this is not a one-party failure. The question, though, is how forcefully Mr. Trump has promised the opposite. He talked about reducing debt through tariffs, energy revenue, and even Bitcoin. But the government's own analysts say his flagship legislation is moving in the opposite direction. Even without the bill, the United States is on a collision course. Until the dollar rises, the basic fiscal path is unsustainable. One economist said bluntly that there is no doubt that the United States is on an unsustainable track. Borrow, spend, repeat. At present, the Treasury Department's clock reads just north of $36 trillion, a figure that requires each American to erase about $100,000 overnight. That number has doubled in less than a decade. And both sides are responsible. Even excluding pandemic spending, the pattern is strikingly consistent, with president after president spending more than you earn year after year. But a single raw number does not prove a problem. What really matters is the relationship between debt and national solvency. If you owe a friend $100, the severity depends entirely on your income. Between jobs, that $100 can ruin your month, but you make millions of dollars that you won't even notice. In terms of size alone, the U.S. economy can withstand huge debt, but not unlimited. Publicly held debt is now just over 100% of GDP, meaning the country's debt is slightly higher than its annual output. The comparison underscores the real problem, which has not happened in the United States since World War II. After the war, leaders reduced debt. No one changed course after the Great Recession pushed it from 30% to 70%. The same thing happened after the epidemic pushed it from 70 to 100%. The crisis pushed that number up, but nothing could bring it back. So where did the math break? 175% of GDP is the threshold that many economists consider truly dangerous. At that level, annual interest payments consume so much of the budget that no actual combination of tax increases or spending cuts can dig you out. Greece learned from the painful experience of the early 1980s, when debt soared more than 175%. The government was forced to impose brutal austerity, cut services, cut pensions, saw unemployment soar, and the economy plunge into a deep, long-running recession. The recovery took years. Today, the United States is far from close to 175%, but its pace of climb is noteworthy. The Responsible Federal Budget Committee predicts that Mr. Trump's full agenda could push that to 143% within a decade, or close to 161% at worst. The Congressional Budget Office has extended the timetable further, predicting that if all proposed tax cuts become permanent, U.S. debt could reach 200% of GDP by the end of the 1940s and 250% soon. One analyst put it simply that the legislation could double the country's debt burden within 30 years. None of this needs to happen for the real consequences to emerge. Anyone who simply needs to borrow from the United States will lose confidence that anyone in Washington has a plan. Shake the foundation. U.S. government debt has long been considered one of the safest investments in the world because the country has been paying its debts in full and on time. When investors buy treasuries, they call it the yield risk-free rate. Not shiny, but reliable. What changed everything was the moment assumptions began to waver. If investors start to doubt America's fiscal health, lenders will demand higher interest rates to compensate, and those higher rates will make everything more expensive. If bond rates rise by just 1 percentage point, the U.S. will owe an additional $300 billion a year, according to J.P. Morgan, and interest payments have reached $1.1 tn a year. There is already a troubling sign in the data that the United States borrowed $1.8 trillion last year, of which more than $1 trillion was directly used to pay interest on outstanding payments. This is the financial equivalent of opening a new credit card to pay the minimum payment on the old card. Moody's recently canceled the country's last remaining top credit rating, referring to years of rising debt and ballooning interest costs. Their message was blunt. You're in debt, you're spending too much money, and no one has a solid plan to fix it. Radioactive dust. Understandably, no one wakes up thinking about federal fiscal health. But what happened in Washington won't stay in Washington. Treasury rates set a benchmark for almost every interest rate in the consumer economy. From mortgages to car loans to small business loans to credit cards. As bond yields climb, borrowing becomes more expensive, meaning thousands of extra dollars to buy a home, higher monthly car payments, and higher costs for anyone trying to start a business. Those numbers reshape household budgets. Every dollar used to pay interest is a dollar the government cannot spend elsewhere. Now, 14% of the entire federal budget goes to interest, more than the United States spends on defense. If the current path remains unchanged, debt repayment may eventually exceed Social Security or healthcare expenditure. Economists worry most about what will happen when the next crisis arrives. The pandemic has proved that governments need the ability to spend heavily in emergencies. But heavily indebted governments don't need it at all. Say, you get into a debt crisis. You can't borrow money to get out of it. Defenders of the bill argue that it will pay for itself through faster growth, driven by deregulation, energy production, and tariff revenues. White House programs have grown 3% a year for a decade. But the prediction goes straight to history. A decade of sustained 3% growth has barely happened in the United States. With several quarters in the 20th century, one analyst described the White House calculations as a fictional work with no models behind it. Nonpartisan groups, including the Congressional Budget Office, have come to the same conclusion that debt will continue to climb under any realistic scenario. Almost every credible voice agrees that the United States still has time. But that window has narrowed over time, and no one seems to be in charge to fight for it. As one economist put it, debt crises happen slowly and then, suddenly, and when they arrive, all the available solutions are painful. Understandably, no one wakes up in the morning thinking about the federal government's financial health. But what happened in Washington did not stay in Washington, and the ripple effect was far broader than most people realized. Treasury interest rates not only determine the cost of government borrowing, but also set a benchmark for almost all interest rates in the consumer economy. Mortgage rates, auto loans, small business loans, and credit card rates all follow government bond yields. When those yields climb, borrowing costs rise across the board, meaning thousands of dollars more to buy a home, higher monthly fees for a car, and higher costs for anyone trying to start a business. These are not the numbers on Bloomberg's terminals, but those that reshape household budgets and force families to make harder choices. There is also opportunity cost that nobody talks about. Every dollar used to pay interest is a dollar the government cannot spend on anything else. It accounts for 14% of the federal budget and pays interest that exceeds the state's defense spending. If the current path remains unchanged, Debt repayments could eventually exceed the state's spending on Social Security or health care, squeezing out investment in infrastructure, education, and research year after year. Economists worry most about what will happen when the next crisis arrives. The pandemic has proved that governments need the ability to spend heavily in emergencies. But a heavily indebted government has no firepower at all. If future shocks hit, whether it is another pandemic, a military conflict, or a severe global recession, there will be no fiscal room to deal with them. Once you get into a debt crisis, you can't borrow money to get out of it. Now, defenders of the bill argue that the situation is not as dire as it seems. Some Republicans believe the legislation will pay for faster economic growth, driven by deregulation, expanded energy production, and tariff revenue. The White House projected annual growth of 3% over the next decade, saying pace would generate enough tax revenue to offset all new spending. But the prediction goes straight to history. The United States has seen little sustained growth of 3% for a full decade. And the quarters that reached that level occurred in the 20th century. In a modern economy, moving even 0.3 of a percentage point of growth over a decade is a major success. And there is no real precedent for a full percentage point shift. One analyst described the White House calculations as a fictional work with no models behind it. Nonpartisan groups, including the Congressional Budget Office, have come to the same conclusion that U.S. debt will continue to climb under any realistic scenario. That brings us to the bottom line. In this conversation, almost every credible voice agrees on one thing, and the United States still has time. The crisis has not yet arrived and the window for change is still open. But the window shrinks year by year, and no one in power seems to be fighting for it. As one economist put it, debt crises happen slowly and then suddenly, and when they arrive, all the available solutions are painful.